So, Doc, you've read comic books when you were young, right?
I did. Usually the ones that were based after horror movies that I watched. I didn't like collect.
Did you ever read any Marvel comic books at all?
None.
There was this series called What If.
Okay.
And the whole thing, it was this series where they would take different scenarios of like superheroes and be like, well, what if this happened to Peter Parker as opposed to this? Like, what happened if... just different scenarios to make you think. Like,
I believe Marvel's bringing that down the pike here.
Yeah. There was that, and there was actually like a joke. What if one that they made were like, well, what if Tony Stark made the suit of armor, but he had an overeating problem as opposed to being an alcoholic, and they show him like making extensions onto the iron and stuff like that. So
what if?
So I always think about that. There's always different scenarios I think about when it comes to like what if kind of things. And if there's any band that you can go, that I could have a field day with asking what if questions is the Beatles. There's some questions I want to ask, some what if scenarios.
Okay.
What if, originally the Beatles, it wasn't always John, Paul, Ringo.
They had Pete Best as a drummer.
Pete Best as a drummer, and they had Stu Sutcliffe as a bass player.
Right.
So,
and if I recall, Paul was in the band too at the time when Stu was there.
I think he was. I think he was playing guitar though.
He was just playing guitar. Okay.
So what do you think? So the first what if question is, what if the Beatles stayed a 5-piece band and never got Ringo? Do you think that would have changed anything?
They may have still it might have been something where those planets were aligned where they just stayed playing in supper clubs and lunch clubs.
You don't think they would have succeeded as like they did?
Maybe those four. I'm always a big thing when, I'm not a spiritual person at all, but I do believe that if things are aligned and you have right elements, something just happens.
Yeah.
And if Stuart was in the band, they may have gone on and it could have been this equally amazing thing. But I'm going to say if Stuart, or even like if Pete Best was playing and they just kind of stayed there, they'd just be kind of playing, pubs. And if they did experience any sort of success, it might have been like a few hits and then 30 years down the road, they're playing the casino circuit or fairs, or as we call it, the corn dog circuit.
So essentially, they'd be another Dave Clark 5 or like the Jerry and the Pacemakers, or something like that.
Or Herman's Hermits.
Yeah.
Mrs. Brown, you got a lovely daughter.
Well, this is something I always think about.
I don't know.
This is just like I was saying. It's like John, Paul, George, and Ringo.
There you go.
You got 4, and I've always
the Fantastic Four.
And I've always felt that like bands that have 5 members in it is too many people. And what happens is I think a big thing with the Beatles is those 4 personalities.
Yeah.
That like someone had their favorite Beatle.
Right.
And it was these different. Like let's just talk about like a band like Aerosmith or like Guns N' Roses, like more so like Aerosmith or like the Rolling Stones. When you start to have a 5-piece band, then the 2 personalities, it's usually 2 personalities, the singer and the lead guitar player.
Yeah.
It's like Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, but no one really talks about Bill Wyman. Or you talk about Aerosmith, it's like Joe Perry and Steven Tyler, but no one talks about Brad Whitford. It's like. I think there's too many personalities, and I think the thing about the Beatles is that there wasn't any lead singer, that they all sang.
They did.
They all took turns.
That was actually very cool.
Well, I mean, obviously John and Paul took care of most of the singing.
Yeah.
George sang a couple songs, Ringo sang like 1 or 2. But you had 2 different singers, where a lot of times you have like the lead singer of the band. Mm-hmm. And I think if they would have stayed a 5-piece band, I have a feeling that John Lennon would have been like, well, he's always been sort of like the leader of the band.
Yeah.
But I think he would have been more prominent as the front man of the band. And then it'd be like the Beatles, but it would be a lopsided band. It wouldn't be, because I think just having the 4 members kind of leveled them all.
I think it boils down to what I said. The greatest bands have certain elements, and I think they all come from different backgrounds for the most part. You know, they all come from these different places, and
Yeah.
they make that sound. I think, if I recall, John Lennon and Stuart Sutcliffe were like really dear friends. They were like really good friends. They probably had like a lot of,
Yeah.
and I mean, they all actually had something in common, but I think there was just enough not in common to make it what the Beatles were.
Yeah.
And I think that goes with the Rolling Stones or the Kinks or any of those bands from back then. They all, when you have different forces of nature come into the same thing, I think it makes a certain sound.
So what you're saying, if I'm getting things right, is the fact that when you got the lineup of George, John, Paul, and Ringo, it was like
the planets were aligned.
The planets were aligned,
Right.
And you just don't get that impression when it was a 5-piece with Stu Cluff.
No, and then you got to think about what they were doing. I mean, I'm not to say that. I'm sure when Ringo Starr joined the band, that's when the creative energy came in. Because up until that point, I want to say that they probably had a few of their originals, but back in those early days in Liverpool and Hamburg, they were doing a lot of covers.
Oh, a lot of covers.
And I mean, they played nonstop.
Have you ever read the book Outliers from Malcolm Gladwell?
I haven't.
But have you heard of it?
I haven't even heard of it.
Okay, it's the name, the premise of the book is that anyone who's great at something, they just didn't become that way overnight.
Right.
They put a lot of time in, and I think he came up with 10,000 hours. Like you was talking about, like Bill Gates. Like the reason why he became Bill Gates is he had a unique opportunity living here and going to the UW and having all this time that he was able to like be in front of a computer like back then,
Right.
And just having that opportunity to have that access for that much time. He talks about the Beatles, and it's my favorite Beatles story. The Beatles, when they went to Hamburg, essentially they were playing strip clubs,
Right.
and they're the backing band for the strippers. But they would play.
I've gotten to do that.
But they'd play like literally like 12, like insane, like 5 o'clock in the afternoon to like 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever the fuck it was.
Yeah.
So by the time they finished doing the Hamburg stuff, and by the time they actually came to like America, they have put so many hours playing together that they were a machine.
Right.
Before they even made it here. And something I think about too is like, let's just talk about the integrity of bands and band members. What I love about the Beatles, it was always them. It ain't like halfway through their career,
lineup
like,
changes.
well, George left, and then they got this other guitar player, and like even with like the Rolling Stones, there's been lineup changes throughout the years.
But there's been that solid core group.
And I really think like when you get 5 people in a band, you got to think one of those guys, at least one of those guys, wouldn't have, after playing the Hamburg thing for a while, they're like, you know what, I'm done with this.
Well, yeah. That goes back to what what I've always said about bands. What I've always said, to younger guys that are coming up. It's like, if you join a band and you got 4 or 5 guys, whatever, and 4 of those guys want to be rock stars, but you got the one guy who just wants to have a good time. You just get rid of that guy who wants to have a good time.
Yep.
There's 4 rock stars in the band. If you have to have 5 people, better have another rock star in there. And that goes vice versa.
Yep.
If you're in a band with guys who are just wanting to have a good time, play a couple of gigs on the weekends, whatever, but nothing that's going to throw their life into upheaval, because that's what rock and roll does. It throws everything you know about life into upheaval.
Yeah.
And you got to be along for the ride.
And obviously all the members of the Beatles were, because
Yeah, but you get 4 guys. Oh, we're just doing this to have fun. But then they get a peacock.
Well, then
they get a peacock in the band.
Well, didn't Stu
Get rid of that fucker.
leave because he wanted to spend more time with his girlfriend or something like that?
Girlfriend in art school, right? Didn't have something to do with art
Yeah,
school?
something like that.
Yeah, so there you go.
So there you go.
But that's what happened to Stuart. That's what I think would happen with Stuart and Pete Best in the band before it became the Beatles that we know and love. I'm going to just roll the dice and say, maybe they would have made a couple of hits. I don't know that they would ever met Brian Epstein. Had they met Brian Epstein at the time? I don't recall.
Not at that point.
I'm going to just say they would have made a few hits, and then they would have been playing the casino circuit in the 90s and 2000.
If they were lucky.
What was left of them.
Next what if question. Now, obviously, one thing that has made the Beatles great is the fact that they are a band that evolved. Like when you think about like She Loves You to like
They transitioned
to Tomorrow Never Knows to
from Beatles for Sale to Rubber Soul. That there,
even there's such a jump, right?
You go
Rubber Soul to Revolver, right?
Revolver to to Magical Mystery Tour.
There's a constant of evolution, and it's all great.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, like I love the early Beatles stuff, like Please Please Me with the Beatles. The early stuff, I love. That's all great rockin' stuff. And they were already huge. Huge. And the Beatlemania was already going on when they were doing that stuff. So here's the question. Say, what if the Beatles never
evolved?
They just stayed
She
at
Loves You, yeah.
They just stated I Want to Hold Your Hand and just continued to write music like that.
They would have been a casino band.
You think so?
Yes.
Why?
Well, that style.
Because that's great music.
No, it's fantastic
it's awesome.
music. But I honestly feel that if they stayed together, through the 80s or whatever, I think they would have been on the corn dog circuit. Fairs, casinos. Because up until the 60s, I mean, they still had a lot of hits, though. But, I've spent a lot of time in those, and that's where that era kind of stops. It kind of just goes into which is fine, they're still making a living, but I don't see that it would have gone much further. There's, like, the stratosphere of rock and roll where those great bands hide out. And if they stayed there, I mean, it was definitely more than a flash in a pan.
This may seem like a weird analogy. Not to compare the Beatles to Robert Downey Jr. But maybe it's kind of the same thing. Where it's like I'm talking about Robert Downey Jr. Like he had an amazing career in the 80s.
Huge.
Less Than Zero, and he had a really great career up until that point, and then he kind of.
Yeah, I mean, the 90s were a little dry for him, and then, he had some personal problems. But
then he comes back as Iron Man. And talk about a whole, like John Travolta.
Yeah.
John Travolta was huge when he did, like, Saturday Night Fever and Grease and all that stuff. And Welcome Back Kotter, then he kind of went away. And then he comes back with Pulp Fiction. And now he has a whole other career.
You got a second wind.
So maybe
some people get a second wind.
So would you say maybe the situation with the Beatles, it's like, they would have gotten big, and they were big, but then they would have just sort of been considered that they were great for what they were, but they would have stayed. They would have never gone.
I personally don't think that they would have ever gotten to the level that they exist today. Yeah, if they just stayed with. She Loves You, yeah.
Yeah, because
Twist and Shout. I think that there's just kind of a ceiling there.
They would have been a great rock and roll band doing that, but you need what you're saying. So what you're saying is they needed to move on to do A Day in a Life,
and I think Ellis
and to do like the White Album, to be like my guitar gently weeps, to like this is the Beatles. This is the reason why.
And that's what makes the Beatles so amazing, because you have those amazing albums like Sgt. Pepper's A Day in the Life, but they have this whole other career before that.
Yeah.
That was, amazing. It's like they got all these different chances to reinvent themselves, but if they just stayed at, Twist and Shout, I think,
they would have had a great career.
They would still had a wonderful career.
But they wouldn't have been.
But I don't think they would have been the Beatles. It would have been, the Beatles.
Yeah, like I think they would have been. I kind of think of it as sort of like how the Beach Boys are. Like the Beach Boys, a lot of their, a lot of the stuff.
The Beach Boys have been milking it.
And then they finally did Pet Sounds, which is when they finally started to.
And Pet Sounds is said to have what influenced the Beatles to make Sgt. Pepper's.
Yeah, but. The thing about the Beach Boys is like that was kind of it as far as going in. Okay, let's take things further.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too about the Beatles. It ain't like they did a bunch of She Loves You, yeah songs, and then did Sgt. Pepper's, and then like that was it.
There was a big
they kept on going on. I
They
mean,
kept reinventing themselves, and I think the best artists do that. They reinvent themselves, even in pop. You know, I love Madonna. That gal has reinvented herself so many times.
David Bowie.
David Bowie. Think of David Bowie. Every change that guy's gone through. You know, those are the best artists. You know, Marilyn Manson. I've brought that up before.
Yeah.
I've loved everything. You know, there's been time. That's the thing about. Sometimes you're not going to dig you're not going to like everything they do. There's definitely been some albums in there that I was just kind of like, you know, not my bag. But those are the best artists, the ones that constantly are just when they come to the table with a new album, you're like, what are they going to do next?
One good point you made is the fact that it's like, you know, so it is important to evolve and change as a band. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it doesn't work out always.
No,
there's a lot of
seen some bands go in some pretty scary directions.
Yeah, but the difference with the Beatles is they did change and evolve, and they just got better and better and better
consistently.
Yeah. So that being said, here's the next what if question. Obviously, the Beatles broke up after let it be in Abbey Road, 1970.
1970, I want to say, yeah.
And then that was it. I mean, you had there's their discography, solid, right?
Solid.
But what if the Beatles never broke up? What do you think that would have done? Well, first of all, do you think they would have continued to make great music, or do you think they would have started to peter out?
I think they would have started to peter out in the 80s. I think the 70s.
You think they would have been good?
I want you to think about this.
Okay.
I think 80s definitely they would lose some steam.
Yeah.
But the 70s, I want you to think of all their solo albums.
Okay.
And just think of a hybrid Beatles album that doesn't exist mixed with the music off Imagine, but what Paul McCartney's doing in Wings. So you got Live and Let Die, but you got a Beatles version of Live and Let Die. You've got a Beatles version of Imagine and Jealous Guy. You've got a Beatles version of Oh Sweet Lord. You know, all the stuff that, you know,
and then
George Harrison was doing with Phil Spector.
And a Beatles version of It Doesn't Come Easy.
Get into the 80s.
Yeah.
I think everything just it does what bands do. I mean, you think of the Rolling Stones.
Yep.
I mean, the Rolling Stones had what, Start Me Up. But I think you can only catch lightning in a bottle so many times, man, before you just, okay, we're the Beatles. We've had 3 decades. Now we're just going to go out and do the shows, and you know what? We'll still churn out albums that people will buy but probably not listen to, and we'll just play a couple of songs off that. You know, you would have seen the Beatles in the crowd at the We Are the World recording. You know, they would have all been in there singing We Are the World. You know, they would have been a part of all that. And I think that's what the Beatles would have been. They would have been like the Rolling Stones. But I think the 70s would have been great. I think you would have had some bitchin' albums come out.
I think there would have been, say if they continued to put out the albums in the 70s, I don't think they would have had the consistency in those albums that they did with as the Beatles that we know. I think you'd have an album would come out and maybe there'd be like 2 or 3 really great songs, and then the rest of them would sort of be like...
Well, doesn't that happen with most bands, though?
It happens with most bands.
I mean, the longer that they keep churning out records,
it's inevitable.
I mean, like, you listen to stuff that David Bowie did in the 70s, it starts to kind of, like, late 70s, you go into weird territory. But then the 80s, you know, you had Let's Dance and, you know, China Girl. Those are great songs. And then, you know, he goes into weird, but then he was doing all that stuff with Trent Reznor.
Yeah, I don't think...
And I think that was fantastic.
I don't think the Beatles would have been continuing to write great, amazing albums. I think you would have had great, amazing songs from the Beatles going into the 70s. That's my take. And I'll be honest with you, like one of my least favorite, I love all the Beatles albums, but like Let It Be is sort of For me, that album is sort of like...
That song has one of the most depressing songs in the world.
I'm talking about the album.
No, like the Long Winding Road, that is sad. I get bummed out every time I hear it. But I love it. I love that song.
Yeah, but that's like my least favorite album from the Beatles.
It is.
Like, in my opinion, it's sort of like if they would have continued...
It is kind of a death knell.
If they kind of would have kept going, I don't know how much I would dig that direction that they went. I mean, who knows what direction they would go in. But I'm glad. I am glad. I guess what I'm saying is I am glad that they broke up when they did.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that they did. To give you, like, same thing with like Led Zeppelin. Solid discography. Like, well, Into the Outdoor for me is sort of like... I'll throw them a bone with that. But I mean, you're talking about a band that has an amazing discography. You talk about the Rolling Stones, though.
Yeah, you like the cream of the crop. There's the cream of the crop.
The Rolling Stones did exactly that. Every album has a couple of good songs on them.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff that's sort of like, yeah. Here's the next what if question.
All right.
What if the Beatles never stopped touring? Now you can say that, like, well, how would you recreate those songs live once you get into like Sgt. Pepper's and the White Album? Well, the answer is there's been a lot of other bands, cover bands, that have recreated that. Cheap Trick has recreated Sgt. Pepper's live. What do you think? What's your thoughts?
I think that, again, the Beatles were touring, but live sound reinforcement wasn't ready for the Beatles yet.
Okay.
And basically, live sound in general, performance, I don't think was really at the level that the Beatles deserved.
But it wasn't too far away, though.
It wasn't too far away. But that's the thing. They just stopped.
Pink Floyd was starting to like...
Because you got to think, all these bands, in the 70s, that's when Woodstock.
Yeah.
Okay, there's great photographs of Woodstock, them building the PA, and what goes into live sound. And by the 70s, they kind of had an idea of, okay, we got these loud rock bands. This is what we have to do if we're going to have these mass assemblies of people watch them. This is how loud and how big the public address system has to be. And it's only gotten better and better and better over the decades. The Beatles, if they toughed it out and waited till the 70s, I think would have had zero problem recreating their album. Maybe 80s, they would have had to wait to create Sgt. Pepper's on stage like properly. These days, you could do it no problem. It's easy. You could do anything you want these days. Back then,
I think what they should have done is they should have. Well, I'm telling like the Beatles what they should have done. I guess it's more of like my,
guys.
It's more my opinion of it's that what if kind of thing, because it's like, could you imagine going to see the Beatles perform Sgt. Pepper's on stage as an album?
It would be incredible.
Or just them playing just the great songs from the White Album or anything like that. I guess what I'm saying is, if I could have hoped anything, I wish they could have just take a break from touring for like a year or two, and then come back.
Yeah,
because I think going to see a Sgt. Pepper's era or the Revolver era, even the Revolver era of the Beatles live. Imagine seeing Tomorrow Never Knows live, and the Beatles playing it. I think it'd be incredible. I respected the decision that the Beatles did, but I think imagining to go see the Beatles play their later stuff live would have been unbelievable.
If the Beatles were still around today, and I saw Paul McCartney last year,
yeah,
and that was probably the best show I've ever seen. And this is a sound engineer telling you that. I've seen my limit of shows, and that one was absolutely incredible. And it wasn't just because you got an alpha Beatle on stage. He played everything from the early days up.
Yeah.
He ended the show with Long Winding Road, Golden Slumbers, Into the End. I mean, And before that, he played Helter Skelter. I never thought in a million years I'd ever see a Beatle play Helter Skelter, and I watched it. It blew my mind, you know.
I've seen live footage of Paul McCartney playing Helter Skelter, and it's a kick-ass version of it.
It was awesome. It was. I love Motley Crue's version of Helter Skelter, but I
used to until I heard the Beatles version of it,
and then I was just like, "Holy shit!"
No, I saw some footage where it was like Paul McCartney playing on top, like at Dave Letterman's studios, but like outside on top of the marquee.
On top of the marquee.
And they do like back in the USSR, and then Helter Skelter, and I'm like, because I was like my two favorite songs.
Yeah, and Helter Skelter to this day, I think is one of the heaviest songs ever written.
I think it's one of the most important songs ever.
It's heavy. It's like everybody talks about being heavy. We've got to be heavy.
It's
like
powerful.
Listen to that original recording of Helter Skelter.
It still makes my toes curl. It makes my fists clench.
It's amazing.
So
I forgot what we were talking about.
Last what if question.
Okay.
What if the Beatles, now this is being said that John Lennon was never assassinated. I guess this is more of an opinion question. What if the Beatles would have gotten back together after the fact? So obviously late 70s, 80s.
Which they would have inevitably done.
So do you think that would have ever happened?
Of course.
You think so?
They always are. You know, you get to a point where they only keep adding zeros. $100,000. What do you say, guys? And they just be like, get fucked.
Which Beatle?
Let's add a zero.
Which Beatle was that?
The Australian one.
Crocodile McCartney.
They add another zero. 1 million, guys. What do you say? Get fucked. Let's add another zero. That's all they do when they do that for Motley Crue.
So what you're saying is a Beatles reunion would have been inevitable.
It would have been inevitable, and it would have been fantastic. I would say that it would have probably happened in the 80s.
I think
and I would have been too young to give a shit.
I think they would have done it like a Live kind of thing, or
it would have been like
one of those things. Here's the ultimate end what if question.
The third last question.
But this time I mean it. That's my Fred Gwynn from Pet Sematary. This time I mean it. So here you go. What if there was no Beatles? What if the Beatles never existed? What would that have done? How do you think rock and roll would have been? Do you think there would have been another band that would have been considered in reverie, like to that level? Like would have been the Rolling Stones going into that slot? Or is it just the Beatles could have only been the Beatles?
I don't know, it would have just been this weird alternate world where Del Shannon's Runaway was like influenced everybody, and then Beach Boys, and it just kind of makes me sick to my stomach to think about a world without the Beatles.
Just your reaction and just everything that you said in response to that question says everything. And the thing is, I'm listening to you and I agree with you 100%. I really think it would be a sad state of affairs if there wasn't the Beatles.
Yeah, I don't want to live in a world without the Beatles.
No. Me neither. I guess that's
she loves you, yeah.
I want to hold your hand.